writer for SportsIllustrated.com. Dustin Long joins us. Hey, Dustin, how you doing, man?
Hey, doing well, guys. How's it going?
It's going good. I see here your headline, will NASCAR take the edge off Brad Keselowski? God, I sure as hell hope not. We finally got the edge on somebody. Let's not take it off of him, for God's sake.
Well, part of the question, and certainly, Brad Keselowski's certainly been outspoken and not been afraid to share his thoughts, and has certainly been somebody who wants to make. He's not making these comments out of spite. He's not being, trying to be a contrarian. He's not trying to, push people in a direction that he thinks is best for him. It's just like what he said at the end of his speech at the Champions, at the banquet in Vegas last year, was that, he wanted to help unify the sport. He wanted to be a leader for the sport, and he wanted to push the sport forward. And, obviously made the comments to USA Today at Daytona, and kind of called out Brian France and Lisa France Kennedy, and saying that the sport, there were things that were not working together, and there needed to be a better unity in the sport. And, that kind of, led to a meeting with both of those individuals. But, in talking with Brad the other day, he said, if I have to be the bad guy to make this sport and American motorsports grow and be better, then I'm willing to accept that role. And he admits some of the stuff that he said in the article in USA Today that it was on the edge, but he says those are comments that he believes in. And Brad is, Brad is kind of that yesteryear type of driver, and he's going to tell you, what he thinks in most cases, and he's going to be direct about it. Now, certainly, I'm sure there will be times he'll kind of bite his tongue because of, PR or sponsors or things like that. But, he for the most part is going to tell you what it's like. Now, my question that, I posed in the story was, is this something that we can expect to see for, moving forward? And in the case of, he's had the discussions with NASCAR. Certainly he has to be aware of his sponsors. Other drivers have tried it. I think back to Tony Stewart was outspoken early in his career and then got a lot of, brushback from the fans on some issues and really kind of backed down. And, Tony learned that, maybe it's better to, if I've got opinions, to say them behind the scenes and not say them publicly and then be dealing with them for the next several days. And so in that sense, he's kind of, he's kind of taken a step back on his comments. Like I said, I think he does more behind the scenes than what he does, in the public eye. Will Brad have to do that? Will some of the comments that Brad makes moving forward, will they be so biting that he's having to deal with it all the time that it becomes not worth it? And I think that'll be the interesting thing to watch as we look at Brad Keselowski moving forward, through this season and beyond.
Well, one of the interesting things about the relationship between Tony Stewart and Brad Keselowski in this thing is that with Stewart, you almost never knew if he was being serious or whether he was just trying to pull on you a little bit. And with Brad, you get that, at least I get the feeling with Keselowski, when he's telling you something, he firmly believes it, and he's shooting as straight as you're ever going to see. And I think with Stewart, you never quite knew. You had to look in Tony's eyes to figure out whether or not what he was telling you he truly believed, or whether he was just trying to see if he'd get a reaction from you. And I don't know if you feel the same way, but that's.
I think Tony was more direct earlier in his career. I think if the situation came up, I think Tony would be. But Tony also knows, just like, I think like what you're referring to is what Talladega a couple of years ago when he made the comments that some people couldn't tell if were sarcastic or not about plate racing.
Right.
By, in essence, saying such over-the-top and ridiculous comments, he was allowing everybody else to, interpret what he was saying, but essentially he got the message across without really, without coming out and saying, hey, NASCAR's stupid because of this, or this is stupid because he just made it such a ridiculous comment that you're like, okay, is he sarcastic? Is he telling the truth? Because is anybody going to come out and say it this way? But again, he was good in that sense of getting the discussion going by people debating whether he was serious or not, and then he just kept quiet. And he didn't have to say anything else. So, like I said, I remember years ago when Tony was pretty direct. And I think Tony made a comment years ago, talked about in an article about, in essence, the number of fans in the garage, and maybe that needed to be cut back. And it was an opinion that I think a lot of competitors, or most competitors, believed in. But because, certainly the fan is an important part of the sport. It's kind of hard to take something away from the fan once they've been in the garage or had that opportunity to. Although, at the end of the day, you have to understand that's their office. It'd be just like, several people coming into your office and, if you were famous and big enough, just kind of, asking for your autograph or standing in the way or things like that while you're trying to do your job. So in one sense, I understand that. But, also in the other sense, there's a reason, partly, reason why some of these guys get paid the way they do, because they are celebrities, and that's part of it. You don't like it, go back to the short track, go race for the love of the sport, and where you don't have to have as many of those distractions. But when Stewart made those comments, certainly there was a fan reaction, and fans started booing him at introductions, and I think that kind of an impact. It was like really one of the first times in NASCAR that he'd really been booed, because he was looked at as that guy who was, would say what he meant, and was praised for that. And then when he said something that people didn't like, then people booed him and kind of shot back, and Tony said, hey, this isn't worth it. I'm not going to be that guy anymore.
We're talking to Dustin Long, who writes for SportsIllustrated.com. Hey, Dustin, we're talking about the office that these guys work in. Let's talk about the office, this Gen 6 car, which so far in 2 races, 2 tracks, about as different as you can get. Results have not been too racy. At least that's been the discussion on pit road today. What are you hearing in the garage? What do you expect for Las Vegas and the mile-and-a-half tracks? Do we have a winner here, or is it just more of the same?
Well, I think Vegas is. I think a lot of people will be interested to see what happens in Vegas, because nobody's quite sure. Because this will be the first test for the car at a mile-and-a-half track. A lot of effort was put into this car to make racing better at mile-and-a-half tracks. It's like I said, I think there's a big uncertainty. I think there'll be a lot of interest in seeing what happens this weekend. That being said, if the race is fantastic or if the race is a dog, it doesn't mean that NASCAR has solved all the problems, or NASCAR still has a long way, or is way off. I mean, it's only the 3rd race for this car. It's going to take time to get a sense of it, of what it can do, what needs to be done, if anything needs to be done, or what teams need to do to better adjust the car. They're still learning this car. So I think the expectation that the racing is going to be super fantastic and side-by-side and something that NASCAR fans have not seen before, I think if you think that, then I think you're kidding yourself and you're being foolish and you're setting yourself up to be disappointed on Sunday. Now, if you see that type of racing, then that's fantastic. But let's be honest, it's the 3rd race for the car. It's the first time in a mile-and-a-half. There's a lot of work that's gone into it, but there's still a lot of work that probably needs to be done to it. And let's also be honest, if the car came out and was perfect right off at the start, well, what would NASCAR fans complain about that?
Well, here's the deal. Here's
find something.
Here's what I think. I don't have very high expectations for this week. I do think it's going to take a lot of time to get this car to be racy and conditions to be different. And I'd expect a parade at Vegas. That's usually what we get anyway. But I think they need to open up the window and allow these teams, the teams with the money and with the brains that can innovate, parentheses, air quotes, cheat. I think they need to let them do that, because that was.
Then let me ask you this.
Okay.
Then why? Let me ask you, why would you allow that? If you think that the race is going to get spread out Sunday at Vegas with the rules package the way it is, that it's so tight, and now you're going to open it up and you're going to allow Hendrick Motorsports to spend $2 billion in research and testing and computer stuff, and their cars are just going to blow the field away, and Joe Gibbs Racing is going to spend $1 billion, and Roush Fenway is going to spend $1 billion, and you're going to have, you have the potential to have an arms race, which you already have in the sport, but out of control arms race, that there will be absolutely no way that any teams, any team other than 4 organizations can compete, and you're going to run people out, and you have the potential to have more strung out racing. Now, maybe you have great racing among 4 to 6 cars, and if that's what people want, then I say, yeah, let's throw the rule book out and have at it. And if your guy doesn't have a chance in heck to win the race, don't complain about it if you wanted the rule book thrown out.
I think there needs to be more opportunity for the guys with brains. They're really smart guys. Some of those guys have a lot of money behind them, not all of them. But week to week, there needs to be a chance for somebody to do something. I think that's the only way a Hail Mary type thing is the only way somebody like Furniture Row is really going to have a chance against one of these teams. And are they going to beat them week to week? No, they're not. It's still going to be, if you leave the rules the way they are, if you go back to where they were the first year of the COT, you're going to still have the same 5 teams winning most of the races. So I don't see how that changes. All I see is since they started doing that, the popularity of NASCAR has dropped. Now, I don't know if that's a coincidence, but it's certainly a feature of what we've seen the last 5 or 6 years.
And since you mentioned Furniture Row, I'll bring up the point, and I understand what you're saying. I look back and you look at the way the rule book was and the way it was written last year and how tight it was even then. And Kurt Busch, Furniture Row Racing, finished the season with 3 top 10, and 2 of those races were at 1.5-mile tracks where it's supposed to be the big boys.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, obviously that they found a way, and I think you have to understand too, in some sense, is that there aren't too many independent teams. I mean, even Furniture Row, they're essentially the 4th Childress car,
right?
Mm-hmm. Type of thing. So I guess. The point, and I understand, and I've heard it from a lot of people say, hey, open up the rule book, run what you brung, or let's go back to the old days, let innovation be the thing. I think innovation still is an important thing and still plays a role in the sport. I don't think that it is as obvious nowadays as maybe what it was in the past, because obviously in the past there was more room to operate. Now you have a smaller window, so innovation may be finding something that gets you a little bit more an aerodynamic advantage, or is something that is an advantage that is shaving off 1/1000th of an inch here, as opposed to the smoky, unique innovations of finding ways to put extra fuel in the car and having the car drive off after inspection when the fuel cell is empty.
Or a 7/8 replica of a NASCAR car like Bill Elliott did.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I think there is innovation in the sport, because I think if there wasn't, I think the sport would be stagnant. I think there's innovation. I think it's harder for us to see it because we're talking about such fine increments. And when you hear Chad Canal say, "Hey, I'd like to," I wish the rule book was you bet, because Chad would find every advantage.
Mm-hmm.
And
yep.
Again, and I'm not saying that every crew chief would, and I'm not saying that Chad and Jimmy would dominate, but I guess I'd say is if those guys dominated, for 5 years with the rule books as tight as it was, and still NASCAR was having to create rules because of things Chad was coming up with, wouldn't you expect the same thing to happen with you open up the rule book that hey, why even show up at the race? Because Chad and Jimmy are going to win it. Yeah. And then we get back to the whole argument. If that happens, then we get back to the whole argument. Well, is Jimmy Johnson ruining the sport because he's making it boring and he's winning it? There isn't that excitement. I don't know. I mean, like I said, I look at Vegas. I couldn't even tell you who went. I mean, certainly you look back at history and you look at some of the things that certain guys have done. But again, there are some new elements there, and maybe the guys that have been good at 1.5 miles and the guys that have been good at Vegas, Tony Stewart has been dominant there the last 2 years. Maybe it carries over. Then again, maybe Tony and his team are way off because they just haven't figured out this car on the 1.5 miles, and somebody else becomes the big dog at the track. I think that's the interesting thing. Now, again, it's a big debate for the sport. How do you maintain that audience? How do you create that audience? Certainly, the Daytona 500 drew in a larger audience than in recent years. The Phoenix ratings were up a little bit. Obviously there's some people who've been intrigued by the sport, looking at it, how do you keep them involved? And again, that, at the end of the day, it does come down to the racing. And, it's just like any sport. If I'm flipping around and there's a basketball game on, and I'm a huge basketball fan, but if it's a 20-point game, I'm gonna flip.
Yep.
And if the leader's out in front by 8 seconds, I'm gonna flip. If I'm a casual fan, if I'm watching a hockey game and somebody's up by 3 goals in the third, I'm gonna flip. I mean, that's the way it is. And then the question becomes, okay, well, if you keep making things tighter and tighter, does it become artificial? Or does it become less of a sport, and it just becomes basically a television show, and it's a sitcom or a drama every Sunday or Saturday night.
Dustin, thanks so much, man. We appreciate you spending time with us as
we'll
always.
We'll talk about this more as the season goes on.
Yeah, I enjoy the debate. I enjoy it. I mean, some interesting points, and like I said, it's I don't know if I agree with everything, but hey, I may not be right, and I may be the one who's wrong on this discussion, and maybe they should open up the rule book. I'm not sure if I see that, but who knows? We'll see where things go these next few weeks.
All right. Thanks, Dustin.
Thanks, man. We'll talk to you again.
Hey,
Dustin Long,
Make sure-
SportsIllustrated.com.
SportsIllustrated.com. Also, you can read his stuff on Athlon Sports and Speed Sport News. We are going to come back, and we'll talk to Dan Beaver when we do come back. This is On Pit Road.